So, good evening, everyone. Please rise to salute the flag. So welcome to the February meeting of the Revere Board of Health. My name is Drew Bunker, Chair of the Revere Board of Health. Joining me tonight for the meeting is Board Member Dr. Craig Costanza. Also in attendance for tonight's meeting are City of Revere staff, Lauren Buck, Director of Public Health, Michael Wells, Director of Municipal Inspections and Health Agent, and Paula Sepulveda, Administrative Assistant. For tonight's agenda, we will we'd like to review and approve the minutes from January 27th, 2022. So, Dr. Craig Costanza, do you approve the minutes from last meeting? Yep, I approve them as well. Next thing we're going to discuss is the Public Health Communicable Monthly Report, and Lauren is going to discuss that.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Bunker. So I'll go over this quickly again this month. Not really anything significant to report in terms of non-COVID communicables. Hepatitis C, we had about 6 cases over the last month. I think that's the most notable thing that I wanted to point out about our communicables. Some other important notes, again, just reporting any interesting news I get from the CDC. The National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day was on February 7th, and a new report by the CDC published on February 7th shows that despite overall progress in reducing HIV transmission in the U.S., HIV continues to affect some groups more than others due to longstanding and ingrained barriers. Black or African American people account for a higher proportion of new HIV infections compared with other races and ethnicities. Black people accounted for 13% of the U.S. population, but 40% of people with HIV in 2019, according to CDC estimates. And then the second interesting kind of report from the CDC over the last month was about wastewater surveillance. Wastewater surveillance has been utilized in terms of tracking COVID-19 trends. I think it's kind of the future in public health. So just a really interesting tidbit about the National Wastewater Surveillance System, which was initiated in September 2020 to track COVID, wastewater kind of DNA markers. So far, 34,000 samples were collected, which represents 53 million Americans. Currently, the CDC is supporting 37 states, 4 cities, and 2 territories to help develop wastewater surveillance systems in their communities. Massachusetts does have a wastewater monitoring system out of Winthrop, out of the state's wastewater system. It's not part of the CDC's tracking system, but hopefully it will be soon. And like I said, this is a really interesting kind of wave of public health knowledge in the future. And I think in the future, wastewater tracking could be used to track antibiotic resistance, foodborne infections, and other emerging pathogens. So it's just something that I think we should all expect to see a lot more of in the future. And then finally, just talking about COVID to give you all an update of where we are as a city. As of February 23rd, we now have 21,712 confirmed cases. Our total deceased to date is 197. Our 7-day case average as of February 23rd was 7.3. This is way down from the Omicron spike that we saw, which is really good. And our 14-day positivity rate is 6.9 as of February 23rd. Again, this is a huge downtrend from the peak kind of in the beginning of January, which is also a really good sign of where we're going. And the last thing I wanted to give you all an update on our vaccination status. This data is a little bit older as of February 3rd. 5 to 11-year-olds are 29% fully vaccinated, 12 to 15 are 79% fully vaccinated, 16 to 19 are 78% fully vaccinated, 20 to 29 are 84% fully vaccinated, 30 to 49 are 88% fully vaccinated, 50 to 64-year-olds are 81% fully vaccinated, 65 to 75 are 84% fully vaccinated, and 75 plus are 69% fully vaccinated. So honestly, all of these numbers are increasing. Obviously, we're continuing to watch the numbers our booster numbers. And just a quick plug, we still continue to have regular vaccine clinics in the city. We'll have them through March weekly. So look on revere.org/vaccine for updates about our vaccine clinics, where you would be able to get a first, second, or booster dose. So obviously, we'll continue to watch those numbers and report back next month.
Excellent, thank you so much. So the next topic is going to be reviewing and discussing the regulations on the keeping of chickens. And Lauren is going to talk about that.
Okay, so this is going to be the majority of our meeting tonight. I just want to make a point that we do have a backyard chicken keeping expert on the line who was really essential in helping us draft these regulations. Just as a reminder, we are promulgating these regulations because of the urban farming ordinance that was passed last year that specifically mentions bees and hens or chickens. And so because the ordinance was passed by the City Council, the Board of Health is then kind of designated to write regulations. The ordinance is kind of a general guideline to use, but then we have to kind of get more detailed in the Board of Health regulations, which is what these are. They are very detailed. We're going to go through them. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. I don't think we're going to be able to vote on these tonight, but you guys are going to hear things. You're going to be able to ask questions if you have any to myself, Mike, or our chicken expert, Christy, who's on the line, who will probably be able to answer some questions about chicken keeping much more in depth than we could. And then we'll make the adjustments that we need to and vote on them next month. But this will be a good time to get all the adjustments that you all want us to put in recorded. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm not going to read word for word every word on these, I don't know, 8 pages. But I'm going to try to hit the highlights. And if there's anything you want me to stop and review, we can do that. All right, so the regulations start, whereas the Revere Board of Health seeks to promote the creation of urban agriculture initiatives to support local access to healthy food, and whereas the Revere Board of Health recognizes the benefits of local food sources as a sustainable practice capable of delivering food of high quality at low cost, now therefore the Board of Health promulgates the following regulation to protect the health of Revere residents, workers, and visitors. Section 1 is really just the purpose of the regulations, just kind of restating what I just mentioned. Section 2 is a reiterance of the authority that the board has to write regulations. This section is present in all of the regulations that the Board of Health kind of votes on. Section 3 is definitions. It defines what an accessory structure is, what the Board of Health is, what chickens mean, what coops, hens, run, pests, what a person, a predator, a property owner, and a rooster mean. And these are to help people understand when they're reading the regulations. They can go back to these definitions to understand exactly what the words in the regulations mean. Section 4, general requirements. We obviously want everyone keeping chickens in Revere to do so in compliance with local, state, and federal, state, and local laws. We want them to keep them in a manner that would not constitute a nuisance. There is a nuisance law in Massachusetts that the Board of Health kind of has a responsibility to enforce, and so therefore we want to make sure that no one is keeping chickens in an unsanitary manner. This is an important one, Part C. This is right in the urban farming ordinance. No roosters or crowing hens are permitted. Obviously, that would be a substantial nuisance in terms of noise for neighbors. D, the number of hens shall be limited to 6. Again, this is right from the urban farming ordinance. And E, the Board of Health or its agent may order the removal of the chickens upon a determination that the chickens pose a health risk or nuisance. Again, reiterating that we have the power to remove chickens in the city if we think that they are a nuisance. Section 5, this is about structure requirements for keeping chickens. I'm not going to go into detail about every point, but basically, there's minimum requirements for an interior floor surface area to make sure that chickens aren't being kept in too small of an area, which could lead to disease. It could lead to unhealthy chickens. It could lead to more smell. It could just lead to bad stuff. So there's an interior minimum requirement. There's also a minimum ground surface area for a run, which is kind of the outdoor structure that chickens have to live with. And this is one point. So Section 5, Part B. The draft that you see is currently reads, a run area is required and must have a minimum ground surface area of at least 12 square feet per chicken. We are looking to amend that on the guidance of Christy, our expert, to reduce this to 10 square feet per chicken. She notes here that, an official minimum could be 12 square feet per bird with an inclusion in the recommendation section to build closer to 15 square feet if they have the space. This will allow a few more folks with smaller yards to keep them without breaking the rules, and 10 square feet is okay. 12 is obviously ideal, but 10 square feet would be enough for each chicken to have enough healthy area. I'll go through all of them and then we can talk about, is that okay? Okay. We also talked about maximum structure height, which is going to be 8 feet. That conforms to building codes and also is a significant enough height that you could walk in it as a person and be okay. Section D talks about that the entire structure, although we have minimum requirements, we also have maximum requirements to make sure that these coops don't have to be fit the requirements to have a building permit unless there's electrical and plumbing, then those permits would have to be applied. So we need the structure to be less than 120 square feet. Anything 120 square feet or more would require a building permit. But all of these need to comply with state and local building codes. Part E talks about setback requirements. Obviously, all of these have to meet municipal building and setback requirements, which are detailed in Part E, 2 feet from the rear property and 5 feet from the side property. Coop and run structures are not permitted in front or side yards. Again, this is right from the urban farming ordinance. G talks about making sure that there's significantly away from high water marks or drinking water sources. This is obviously for sanitary reasons. And we want the coop and structure to be constructed securely to exclude pests and predators. So that is another amendment that we're going to make. Part H will read in the final version, coop and run structure must be constructed securely to exclude pests and predators and must be completely enclosed. Okay. Section 6, moving on, management requirements. So we just talked about building the coops. Now we're talking about managing the flock, okay? Obviously, we don't want any noise at property boundaries. Any noise ordinances must be observed. Part B talks about how we want people to discard of bedding and waste material. We obviously need to conform to existing municipal waste regulations, which is RRO 8.06.020. There's also a composting element, which we should probably talk about after we're finished going over this with Christy. Composting is really common when you're keeping chickens, the bedding and the waste products. It makes for really good compost. I've been told. I don't keep chickens, but so we obviously want to encourage composting. Composting is a good thing. We need to make sure it's done responsibly, and so sometimes sealed containers are appropriate, sometimes not. So we should go back to Section 6, Part B, and talk about that after we go through all the regulations. Odors cannot be perceptible at property lines. Again, Part D is talking about doing chicken keeping in a humane manner. You need to make sure your chickens have fresh food and water, protection from predators and threats and harm. Coop and run must be cleaned and well-maintained. Part E, all chickens shall be confined to a license holder property at all times. The current draft reads, all chickens shall be confined to the license holder's property at all times, and hens must be kept within the enclosed coop and run structure. We might have to go back to this one if the board, we might need to talk about this one as well. Christy makes a good point that potentially good practice is, or not good practice, but it's very common that you let your coop kind of outrange for a limited time in your property. So this is something that we'd have to go back and talk about if we want to specify that we are not going to allow that, or if we should kind of abide by normal practices. Obviously, we don't want to build up a pest and rodent populations, and so necessary measures must be taken to prevent that. G talks about hens may not be kept in the home unless on a temporary basis for health and safety reasons, so long as they are kept in a cage. It is actually, again, common practice for hens to be kept inside if they're ill or if there's reason to believe that they need a closer watch. And so Christy made a suggestion, again, that this reads so long as hens are kept in a cage, but it maybe should read so long as hens are kept in a suitable hospital or quarantine cage setup. Again, yeah, so this one we might need to go back to. H, chicken feed must be kept within the pest-proof structure at all times. Again, we might need to go back to this one. A recommendation is to change this to chicken feed must be kept stored in a pest-proof container and or kept within the pest-proof coop and run structure at all times. This would allow people to keep your chicken feed either in a container outside of the coop and run structure or in the coop and run structure, essentially open, not in a container for chickens to eat. Okay. Chickens shall not be butchered within sight of neighbors and meat must not be sold. This is kind of a state regulation that we included. J talks about what to do when a chicken dies. There's 3 options. You can either secure it in a triple layered plastic wrap or bag, dispose of it with municipal waste as per regulations. You can take it to a veterinarian for disposal as long as the veterinarian does that. Or you can bury it in the backyard at least 2 feet deep, not within 50 feet of a water drinking source not within 50 feet of a water drinking source, including a well, with a heavy object placed on top of burial. And the heavy object, through lots of reading, if you bury a chicken, predators, even like dogs, potentially could dig it up. So the purpose of the heavy objects on top is to prevent that. I don't know how specific we want to get about what a heavy object is, but yeah, so I'll leave that there. And then the last part of section 6 is K. The death of a chicken kept pursuant to such license shall be reported to the Board of Health within 2 business days of the chicken's death. We probably want to come back to this point as well. Christy made a recommendation that we move this to the recommendations section instead of keeping it in the regulations because of A, enforcement issues, and B, the purpose of alerting the Board of Health is if we are concerned about potential disease spreading within a flock. But I think Christy points out that the diseases that would form in a flock are actually potentially pretty rare. She notes that this would be an unenforceable category and actually very rare for a backyard bird to die of a disease that is of state or federal concern. Most common causes are predators, reproductive issues, or cancers, or just dying without much advance. So this is something that potentially we can revisit once we're finished reviewing all of the guidance. Okay, section 7 talks about what is required for a license and the fact that a license is required once these are passed for people to keep chickens in the city of Revere. Section 7 details what is required for a license, and I won't go into all the details here except for a couple of important points. Obviously, we need contact information. We need a scale drawing of the property with setbacks and accessory structures. We need a written consent from the property owner. This is assuming that the property owner is not the one applying for the chickens. This is assuming if there is a renter who is applying, the property owner who owns the property needs to sign off that they are allowing the renter to keep chickens on their property. I'm going to skip D and come back to it. Basically, E is talking about that we need a detailed waste management plan. We need a detailed plan for dealing with sick chickens and a detailed emergency plan in the event that a chicken needs to be evacuated or temporarily relocated. So we are going to make an amendment to section E as well. The way it currently reads right now, an application must also include a detailed waste management plan that includes cleaning practices for coop and run structure, feed and water containers, and which bacterial viral cleaning solution will be used. That last section, and which bacterial viral cleaning solutions will be used, is going to be taken out. Christy, again, who is the expert on backyard chickens, makes a note that cleaning solutions don't actually need to be used to make sure that the coop is clean. And so that's kind of a not necessary statement. Part 3, a detailed emergency plan in the event that chicken needs to be relocated will be reworded to say, a detailed emergency plan in the event chickens need to be evacuated or temporarily relocated, as long as you guys are okay with those changes. Okay, I want to go back to D. So D currently states that a written verification of all immediate abutters to the address on the application stating that they have been notified of the applicant's intent and informed that they have the right to express concerns to the Board of Health at a public hearing where application is being considered for issuance or renewal. This is something we have included. Again, this does not mean that abutters get the final say in whether someone can keep chickens or not. It's detailing that this application requires that someone who is applying to keep chickens has to notify the abutters that they are putting an application in to keep chickens, and that if the abutters are concerned, they can come to a Board of Health meeting where the application is being reviewed. Not that they have the final say on whether or not this person actually gets the application. This is something that has, we've discussed it back and forth with other regulations as well. And I think chickens, I'll be frank, we talked about this in terms of keeping bees. And because of what Mike and I learned about beekeeping and chicken keeping, we think it might be more important to stay in this regulation for chicken keeping rather than beekeeping. But again, we can take it out if you guys want. We can leave it if you guys want. I just want to make sure that you're both aware of the nuances of that particular stipulation. Okay. Licenses are not transferable. There is a license application fee that is consistent with beekeeping fees. It's $50. I'm going to remove Part J, which states the Board of Health will accept new applications until March 1st of each year. It can be a rolling admission. Section 9 talks about renewing a license. All licenses need to be renewed annually. There's another $25 fee to do the annual renewal process. And renewals need to be submitted to the Board of Health no later than March 1st of each year. Section 10, this is basically just saying that we will notify the property owner and the applicant that we have received an application and that we will be scheduling a time for them to come before the Board of Health to make a decision on their application. Section 11 details hearings. This is almost directly taken from, again, other Board of Health regulations regarding urban farming, but it's basically just the intricacies and legalities of public hearings and what it means. I'm not going to go over this part in much detail. Section 12, this is talking about how we enforce and how we can enforce the regulations through potentially violations if needed. Again, these are extremely consistent with our beekeeping regulations, almost word for word, just to keep everything consistent. We do have the ability to enforce the regulation. We do have the ability to have public hearings about, an applicant's, if they're contesting a violation, all of this is detailed here. Section 13 details inspections. The Board of Health or its designee may inspect a chicken coop at any time to investigate whether there has been a violation of the regulation. We can do this when there is a written or oral complaint about the keeping of chickens, or we have received an application for the issuance of a license, or the request for the modification of a license. Section 14 is basically stating that if we think there's an imminent health hazard, we have the right, or we are able to require that chickens be immediately removed at the chicken keeper's expense without a hearing. Okay, almost done. Section 15 talks about penalties. These are basically outlining that we can, the legality of violating the regulations. Section 16, severability. Again, this is more legal verbiage that is included in both this and the beekeeping regulation. And then finally, Section 17 is recommendations. We included this section. It's not in our beekeeping regulations, but it is included in chicken keeping regulations because of the intricacies of keeping chickens. So I just want to read what is written. The following section details recommendations and best practices for chicken keeping. These recommendations are meant to help applicants be successful in the keeping of chickens and comply with the above regulations. So important thing to note, the recommendations are just that, recommendations. They are ways to help people comply to the regulations, but they are not necessarily something that we can, they're not something that we're going to hold someone to in exact detail. They are ways that we recommend that someone is successful in meeting the regulation requirements. There's a lot here. They basically talk about how to keep things clean, how to make sure that you meet setback requirements before you start building, how to make sure you build a structure that is predator and pest proof the first time so you don't have to do it again, to make sure it's rain proof, what type of materials to use for nests, make sure how to prevent potential contamination or illness from collecting eggs, and really just a detailed kind of a more detailed cleaning and management timeline in terms of what needs to be done on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And just a quick note, there will be some changes to the recommendations section as well in terms of some last minute additions and changes of wording from Christy that really don't change much. And again, these are just recommendations. So they're changes that I don't think would affect necessarily, I don't think they're too big. What I'm saying is they're just more wording and formatting stuff. So I don't think they would change too much about from what you're seeing right here. Okay, that was a lot. So I guess the first thing is, do you have, I know I ran through it really quickly. Do you have any immediate questions that jump out at you from what I just ran through in 20 minutes? If not, we can all revisit the sections that I think we should all revisit. But I just want to make sure you don't have any outstanding questions.
No questions for me. If we can just go through the outstanding issues.
No questions either.
Okay. All right. Can we have Christy come on the screen? Oh, great. Hi, Christy. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great.
So I would like to go back to, if we can all turn to section, first of all, I just want to make sure, are you both okay for section 5, part B, changing the minimum ground surface area to 10 square feet instead of 12? Do you have any questions or concerns related to that?
I have no concerns or questions related to that.
Okay, great. Okay, so if Christy can come back on the screen, great. I think we're going to spend the most time talking about section 6, Christy, which is the management requirements for keeping chickens. I'd like you to talk a little bit about section B, composting, if you don't mind. The way that it's written right now, we have chicken bedding and waste must be discarded as per existing municipal waste regulations or composted on site responsibly in a sealed container. Do you mind just commenting about how you think we should change that?
Sure. So my only concern with that section is the sealed containers piece, because if someone is composting in, say, an enclosed trash can, there's not going to be sufficient aeration for the compost to actually break down the way that it's supposed to. So my recommendation is to just either take out the in sealed containers piece or update that to something along the lines of an appropriate container designated for composting or something along those lines, so that you are being clear that if you don't want them to be putting their bedding and manure in a trash can and letting it sit because it'll get really stinky. You want them to be putting it in a composting structure, if anything, so that it is breaking down properly. And to understand also that for chicken bedding and manure, if there's no chicken feed in it, which for many there won't be, it doesn't actually necessarily need to be sealed because there's nothing in that that's going to attract pests. It's the food that would attract a pest. So that's another option, but I think if you wanted to specify that it needs to be in an appropriate composting container, that makes a lot of sense.
And just one question for the group. So I've seen composting containers, you can buy them at like a Home Depot or even online. There isn't a specific composting container that is specific for chicken keeping, correct? It's a general composting container. Am I asking the right question?
Yeah, that is correct. And you mentioned, I think it's mentioned somewhere else in here, but to note that with chicken bedding, you'll have a really large volume. So there are a lot of composting containers that are marketed as being for an urban setting, but they're very small and they're intended to be primarily for kitchen waste. So for chicken bedding, likely they'll need a larger one. And the common one that many towns offer at a subsidized rate is called the Earth Machine. It's the big black R2D2 looking structure that's about maybe 3 feet tall and 1.5 feet in diameter.
Okay, got it. So that's something that we could potentially add on to the recommendation, which you're right, does mention composting, bedding, and manure is often higher volume than you would expect for a typical urban compost bin. Okay. All right, if Christy, if you're okay with us, first of all, are we okay with the changing B to an appropriate composting container instead of a sealed container? Okay.
Yes, that's fine with me.
Okay, great. All right, section 6, part E. Christy, could we talk a little bit about the current regulation specifies that hens must be kept in an enclosed coop and run structure. You mentioned that it is common practice to have kind of, I'm not going to use the right word, but kind of free ranging in your property. Could you talk a little bit more about that common practice?
Absolutely. So this is, in our process, and you mentioned this earlier, but we talked a lot about things that are practically enforceable by the Board of Health and things that are not enforceable. And I think the practice of people deciding to let their birds out into some section of their property for a little bit of time every day or something, you're not going to be there every day to actually see that. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that is very common. For example, people come home from work, they let their birds out in the garden for an hour while they're out there spending some time with them, and then they put them back in their enclosed structure that is where they're otherwise protected, that's pest and predator proof, where they could be 24 hours a day, 365 days a year and be fine. But that practice is to let them out a little bit. So I think for this section, the chickens shall be confined to the license holder's property at all times is sufficient, because that's the idea is that's when things start to become a problem for neighbors, is if the birds end up on their property because people are letting them out all day long and they are not keeping them on their property in a sufficient manner.
Right.
So that's the piece of it that I think is really the important part, and keeping them in the enclosed coop and run structure is both not necessary and not enforceable. Understood.
Any concerns about removing that section?
No, not at all.
No concerns here.
Okay. All right, great. So we're going to take that out. Let's talk. All the other changes to the management section, I think, don't necessarily require, a conversation but one that I think does. Let's talk a little bit about section H. Currently, section H reads, chicken feed must be kept within the pest-proof structure at all times. And the recommendations that Christy is suggesting we make would have Part H read, chicken feed must be kept stored in pest-proof containers and/or kept within the pest-proof coop and run structure at all times. Christy, do you mind talking a little bit about, obviously, you know, when we're writing these regulations, our concern is that we know that the feed is really what attracts pests and predators. So we want to make sure that people are feeding their chickens in a way that helps reduce that. Just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the changes to be made to this one, and you know, and then we can feel a little bit better about making those changes, or you know, just could you talk a little bit about Part H?
Absolutely. So this is acknowledging that many people build really big structures for their flock, and many build structures that are a little bit smaller. So the priority is that you want to be sure that the structure has plenty of room for the birds, and that's where we come back to that 10 square feet of outdoor space for them, and 2 square feet per bird of the coop space. So it's a very common practice for people to keep their big 50-pound bag of feed in a rodent-proof container outside of that structure, which then allows the interior of the structure to be maximized for the hens. And if they have, say they have a waist height structure rather than a walk-in level structure, having a big trash can of, you know, feed inside there just doesn't really make much sense, and it's not very clean. So having the feed kept separately as long as it's in a rodent-proof container is totally common and fine. And then again, because we already have in the regulations a requirement that they have constructed the coop and run in such a way that is pest-proof, any feed that they have, and it's common practice and healthy for chickens to have free access to their feed at all times. So that feed, as long as it is kept in that structure, their feeder, then that will be sufficiently kept from pests because it's in this structure that's been designed to accomplish that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for detailing that. Are we all okay with that change to be made? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And the last part we should talk about is Section 6, Part K. This details the death of a chicken kept pursuant to such license shall be reported to the Board of Health within 2 business days of the chicken's death. So this is something that I added in after Christy and Viviana and all of us have talked a ton, because I saw it in some other city or town regulations. The recommendation from Christy is that we move this out of a regulation and into a recommendation. And I would just like her to talk a little bit about the theory behind putting it in some town regulations. I believe is because we would want to be notified if there was a concerning death in terms of illness of the bird. But Christy, would you like to talk a little bit about this?
Sure, and it's actually relevant at the moment. I don't know if you guys are aware that avian influenza has popped up again on our current Atlantic flyway. So that's been a big talk in the chicken keeping world right now, as far as how to minimize the exposure of your flock to that particular disease. So this is another one that's sort of in 2 parts. One being that whether or not they notify the Board of Health if a bird dies is not something you can enforce because you won't know otherwise. So that's another tricky thing to put in there. The other piece of it is that it's very common for hens to die in a way that the owners maybe didn't realize they were even sick. Prey animals tend to hide illness really, really well, so they don't act sick like a dog or a cat does before the point that they're actually usually very sick. And chickens are in this weird middle ground where sort of between like a gerbil and a cat, where a lot of people just don't think to take them to a vet because that's considered to be expensive. So it's common that a bird might die and we don't know why. Having said that, the likelihood of the diseases that are of state or federal concern is really low because there are these testing procedures in place. So the state, the country has a natural poultry improvement program, NPIP is what that's called, And our state offers free testing for any poultry flock to test for the diseases that are commonly of concern, which are Salmonella pylori and typhoid or avian influenza. So the occurrence of those diseases in a backyard flock, with the exception of times like now when it occasionally comes through from migratory birds, is extremely low. The likelihood that a backyard bird has died from it is really, really slim. So what I recommend putting in the recommendations is a suggestion that if you do have a bird that dies of unknown causes, we recommend that you notify the Board of Health and, if possible, get a necropsy done to check for these diseases. Also, here is information for the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources to schedule testing for your flock if you would like to do so. And then furthermore, if you have multiple birds die in a short period of time, definitely notify the Board of Health. So if we were going to keep this in the regulations, I would recommend modifying it to say if you end up with multiple birds sick and or dying within a short period of time, and you could specify what that is if you'd like to, that the Board of Health must be notified. But if it's a single bird, I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, great. That was very helpful. So I guess my question to you both is, would you prefer if we move this completely to a recommendations section and stay silent in the regulations? Or do you prefer if we change this to what Christy mentioned, where we would want to be notified if multiple birds die in a short period of time?
I'm leaning more towards the multiple bird, unless I'm not understanding correctly, but what would you say?
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. And you said keep it as a recommendation, or if it's multiple, keep it as a...
Well, yeah, that's what we can decide, right? If we want to move all talk about informing us about bird death,
Yeah.
we can move it to the recommendation section, and therefore, as Christy mentioned, it is probably going to be impossible to enforce.
Yep.
Or we can put in a regulation that if multiple birds die within a short period of time, that is when you are obligated to tell us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because we would want to make sure that you're pursuing testing and reporting it to the right people atop of us. But keeping in mind that none of us are chicken experts like Christy is, although she's hopefully going to be able to be resourced if we have questions once we're enforcing this. I'm not holding you to that, Christy, though. But, you know, I think for us, we need to think about, like, because chickens are going to be allowed, what are we most concerned about in terms of keeping our residents and the other animals in Revere safe? And it sounds to me like the risk of illness would only be a concern in flocks if there were multiple birds dying off. That's what kind of I understand now from this.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right. So do you want to keep the multiple bird die-off situation in the regulations instead of the recommendations? Yes.
I think so.
Okay. Agree?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. So we'll
Lauren,
change it.
I don't know if you can hear
Yes.
me, but if I might suggest then in that case, still including more information in the recommendations to help owners decide which is which, and also to include that information on the testing if they do want to get their flock tested ahead of time for those diseases of concern.
Got
I
it.
think that would be a good thing, a good piece of information to offer as a recommendation.
Okay. Okay, so I will make those changes. So I think we've gone through all of the really big points that I wanted to go back in and hear from our expert about. There are changes that are going to be made to this that I have detailed besides the one we just talked about. I just want to be clear about that. But is there any other changes or any other questions that anyone has, knowing that the complete revised regulations will come to you next month with all the changes that we just talked about? No.
Sounds good.
Yep,
Okay.
I'm agreeing.
All right. Okay. So I just want to say thank you so much to Christy for her time. Thank you, seriously. You have been invaluable in this process. And I would have not gotten anywhere without you. So thank you for lending your expertise to these regulations, and hopefully they will have resulted in regulations that are good for not only chicken keepers, but for all of us in terms of enforcing. So just wanted to say thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you for being so diligent about it. It's great to know that you care enough to make sure that they're right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so that's it for me in terms of chicken keeping. So I will bring these to the next board meeting with changes, and you will vote yes or no at that time.
Sounds like a great plan. All right, I think that's it for the meeting today. So, thank you, everyone, and have a good night.